Welcome back to my channel, Living Well with Mandy. I am Mandy and I'm beyond grateful that you are here today. My sourdough starter is going kind of wild today, so I wanted to take an opportunity to talk to y'all a little bit about sourdough starters and what exactly they are. And also I get a lot of questions about how to get your sourdough starter this big. So not necessarily this big, but how to get this much sourdough starter at once, essentially. So I wanted to explain that with y'all today. Essentially, all a sourdough starter is a live culture of wild yeast and bacteria that comes from our environment, and it gets inside of a jar that contains flour and water. So over time, the yeast and bacteria start to eat on the flour and water, and it starts to create a lactic acid buildup and oxygen, and that's what causes it to rise, which is incredible. It's basically science happening right in your kitchen. So it's fascinating to me. It's fascinating to a lot of sourdough bakers and a lot of people in general. So the bacteria and yeast come from the environment. If you think about your produce and the air in your kitchen and your house, it contains wild yeast and bacteria. So again, it eventually gets into the jar and it starts feeding on the flour and water, and then you have a sourdough starter. So your sourdough starter takes place of yeast in a regular recipe. So this is what causes your baked goods to rise. So you would use this in place of the added yeast in your baked goods. It's very healthy for you. It's fermented, so that natural fermentation is going to be very good for your gut health and your microbiome. So I think that is why we're seeing kind of a shift in people switching over to baking their own sourdough bread, because a lot of people are very into gut health right now. With that natural fermentation in your starter as well as your dough, it's actually very tolerated by people with gluten sensitivities, which is how I initially got started on my sourdough journey. I had a lot of digestive issues and gut problems, and I was not eating gluten for a very long time until I discovered sourdough bread. And now I enjoy and I love sourdough baked goods every day. I don't have any issues with my gut. It never upsets my stomach, and it is the best tasting bread you will ever eat. I also teach sourdough classes, and several people that have taken my sourdough classes were gluten-free for many years and are now eating sourdough bread every day, which makes me so happy. So if you are celiac, I don't recommend eating sourdough, but if you do have gluten sensitivities, give it a try. Maybe start with a small bite and see what happens. But I'm getting on a tangent, which I often do. Let's go back to talking about our sourdough starter. This is my beloved sourdough starter, Roe. She took me about 9 days to create and has since then gone all over the country. She has visited many of your houses, and she's also made a lot of loaves of bread for my community and my family. So we love her very much in our house. And if you have a piece of her, I hope you are loving her too. So I want to primarily talk about how I get this much sourdough starter. And a lot of that has to do with sourdough starter ratios, which can be very complicated for a lot of people to understand. And it was for me at first, but now that I comprehend it, it makes so much more sense. And I will tell you firsthand that I am terrible at math. So if I can understand this, I promise you can too. So I will give you a brief overview and try to explain it as well as I can. And I don't want to say dumb it down, but make it as simple for you as possible. All you have to do to create this much sourdough starter is increase your ratio. And what that means is you will hear a lot of times in sourdough baking the ratio of like 1 to 1 to 1 or 1 to 2, 1, 10, 10. There are different ratios, and all that means is the first number is the amount of starter that you're putting in a jar when you go to feed it. So when you feed your starter, all you're doing is giving it flour and water. So that first number in that ratio is going to be the amount of inactive sourdough starter that you are trying to feed. And then the second two numbers are going to be the amount of flour and water that you add to your starter to feed it. And I always do equal parts of flour and water. I know some bakers that do a smaller amount of water to make a stiffer starter, but I personally, just to keep it simple for me and just my personal preference, I always do equal parts of flour and water. So I'll give you an example. If you take 25 grams of your sourdough starter and you're wanting to feed it a 1:1:1 ratio, what you're gonna do is you're gonna give it 25 grams flour and 25 grams of water. So all three numbers are gonna be the same. If I wanted to do a higher ratio, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to increase my flour and my water. So I'm gonna do, if I wanna do, for example, a 1:2:2 ratio, I would do 25 grams of my starter and I'm gonna feed it 50 grams flour, 50 grams water. And then it just goes up from there. So what I like to explain to my sourdough classes, I think that my starter, y'all, I think that the lid might come off. I see a lot of craziness happening inside this jar. It's very exciting and kind of crazy. She's distracting me, which she does very often. So back to ratios. We'll try not to be distracted by row, but so you can use the ratios to your advantage. And what I like to explain to my sourdough classes is I like to imagine my sourdough starter as little tiny hungry people that are ready to eat. So if I feed them a 1:1:1 ratio, that is a smaller amount of food that they're going to get. So they're going to get through that really quickly. They're going to eat through all that food and then they're going to be hungry again. So your starter is going to ferment much faster at a lower ratio. Oppositely, if you feed it a higher ratio, say you even do a 1:5:5 ratio, your little hungry people are gonna take a while to get through all of that food. So your starter is gonna ferment at a much slower rate. You can use that to your advantage in situations, say if you want your starter to ferment very quickly, you can feed it a lower ratio. If you want it to ferment a lot slower, say you feed it right before you go to bed so you have the whole night to get through, you can feed it a higher ratio and then it's gonna take a lot longer for it to get through all that food. Does that make sense? So to get this amount of starter, I'm not even joking, it's gonna blow up on us. To get this amount of sourdough starter, what you're gonna do is you're gonna feed it a higher ratio. So say you have 100 grams of starter that you're feeding. You can even feed it a 1:5:5 ratio. So you could do 100 grams of starter from the day before or your inactive starter that you know you need to feed. And then you could feed it 500 grams of flour and 500 grams of water. So then you're gonna end up with almost, well, a little over 1,000 grams of sourdough starter at the end. So that is kind of how I do it. This one, I think what I did was I did a 1:4:4 ratio because I did feed it last night, but often when you have a lot, it still takes a long time to get through. So it will ferment at a much slower rate. So I fed this one, I think it was 100, I started with 100 grams of flour and then I did 100 grams of starter into the jar. And then I fed it 400 grams of flour and 400 grams of water. So it was a 1:4:4 ratio. I fed this last night about 10 o'clock. It is now 9 o'clock and it's going crazy. So it took, almost 12 full hours for it to reach this point, which was perfect because it was overnight. So I hope that helps. I know it can be a little complicated, but try not to make it, as complicated as it sounds. And obviously, if you have any questions, drop a comment below. I have a free sourdough starter guide that I'm going to leave the link to below. And I hope that helps. And now I have to bake some bread with this crazy starter.